Hollow Pine, Colorado. For 41 years, the people of this small mountain town told themselves a comforting that the Widow's Ridge Trail simply took people sometimes the way mountains do, swallowing the unlucky and the careless into weather and rock and elevation. 5 hikers vanished off that trail between 1983 and 2015, almost exactly apart, 8 years. And every single time, the same beloved local volunteer led the search for them came home empty-handed and was thanked by the whole town for trying so hard. It took a wildfire, a buried filing cabinet bolted to a concrete slab, and one frightened woman who had been disbelieved for 33 years to finally show Hollow Pine that the mountain had never taken anyone. A man had. The Cedar Gulch fire burned through 11,000 acres of national forest in August of 2024, and when the Forest Service sent a survey crew up to assess the damage along the old Fire Lookout Road, they found something the flames had uncovered rather than destroyed. The lookout cabin itself had burned down decades earlier, sometime in the late 70s, and nothing had ever been rebuilt on the site, just a concrete slab foundation that locals occasionally hiked past without a second thought. But the fire had stripped away the brush and root systems that had grown up around the slab's edge over 40 years and exposed, bolted directly into the concrete with industrial anchors, was a steel filing cabinet, fire-scorched but intact, rusted shut. It took the survey crew leader, a young forester named Priya Anand, 2 days to get anyone from the county to take her seriously about it. When a deputy finally drove up with a pry bar, what came out of that cabinet would reopen 5 cases everyone in Hollow Pine had quietly agreed for decades not to talk about anymore. Detective Maura Voss had been with the county sheriff's office for 9 years, long enough to know every unsolved case in the file room by heart, and long enough to know that Hollow Pine's missing hikers weren't really considered an unsolved case at all. They were considered a sad fact of geography. The Widow's Ridge Trail climbed nearly 4,000 feet through terrain that turned from forest to exposed scree to sheer rock face in the space of 2 miles. With weather that could shift from clear sky to whiteout in under 20 minutes. And a dead zone for radio and cell signal that stretched almost the entire upper half of the route. People who studied the missing persons file long enough started to believe what the town believed. The mountain took people. It had always taken people. It would probably take more. The 5 names the file Voss inherited when she made detective in 2019 contained 5 names, each with its own thin folder, each folder ending in the same phrase typed by 5 different officers across 4 decades. Search suspended. No remains located. Carl Iverson, 26, a backpacker from Denver, vanished in July of 1983. A hostel clerk in town he planned to summit the ridge and camp overnight before coming back down. He never checked back in. A search lasted 11 days and covered, according to the report, every accessible mile of trail. Nothing was found but his car, still parked at the trailhead, keys in the ignition. Renata Kessler, 31, a geology graduate student studying rock formations along the ridge, in September of 1991. She had been hiking with a research partner who turned back early with a twisted ankle, leaving Renata to continue alone for what she'd said would be just another hour. She never came down. Her partner's statement, buried in the file, described Renata as confident and experienced, not the type to get lost. Tomas Reyes, 44, a contractor on a solo trip to clear his head after a difficult divorce, vanished in October of 1999. His ex-wife told investigators he'd called her the morning he set out, sounding better than he had in months, and said he'd call again once he was back. Down. Helen Castro's son, Danny Castro, 23, a seasonal trail crew worker who knew the route better than almost anyone in town, disappeared in June of 2007 on what should have been a routine afternoon hike on his day off. Helen still lived in Hollow Pine in 2024, in the same small house on Larkspur Street, and she had never once, in 17 years, stopped leaving the porch light on for him. And Whitney Doyle, 29, a photographer who'd come to Hollow Pine specifically to shoot the ridge at sunrise, vanished in August of 2015, the most recent name in the file and the one that finally made the county bring in outside search resources and, briefly, a journalist from Denver who wrote one long piece about the mountain's strange habit of keeping people and then moved on to other stories. Every single search for every single one of those 5 people had been organized and led, in whole or insignificant part, by the same man. Walter Pruitt, founder of the Hollow Pine Volunteer Search and Rescue Unit in 1981, was 83 years old in 2024, and he was, without exaggeration, the most person in town. He ran the outfitting shop on Main Street for 30 years before handing it to his nephew. He'd been named Hollow Pine Citizen of the Year twice. There was a bench at the trailhead with a small plaque thanking him for his decades of service to hikers in trouble. He had, by his own account, and the grateful testimony of dozens of people he'd actually found alive over the years, saved more lives on that mountain than anyone could count. What Voss didn't know yet, standing at the scorched concrete slab in August of 2020 for watching a deputy pry open a rusted drawer, was that Walter Pruitt had also, and at 5, the cabinet inside, hacked in a way that suggested careful, almost reverent arrangement rather than hasty. Hiding, the drawers held personal effects that matched, item for item, the 5 missing hikers' descriptions on file. A wallet with Carl Iverson's Colorado driver's license, the photo showing a young man with an unself-conscious grin. A geology field notebook with Renata Kessler's name written on the inside cover in careful block letters, half its pages filled with rock formation sketches that simply stopped midway through, the rest blank. A wedding ring engraved with initials that matched neither Tomas Reyes nor his ex-wife, which puzzled investigators until they realized it had belonged to his father, the one possession he'd carried with him on every hike since his divorce. A leather bracelet woven with a faded friendship knot that Helen Castro identified, sobbing, within seconds of seeing the evidence photo, as one she'd made for Danny herself when he was 19, and a digital camera, badly damaged by heat but with its memory card miraculously intact, belonging to Whitney Doyle, at the bottom of the last drawer, wrapped in a plastic sleeve that had partially protected it from both fire and 40 years of damp, was a spiral-bound logbook written in a small, neat, almost obsessively tidy entries hand. Weren't dated by year at first glance, just by a private numbering system Voss didn't understand until she'd read nearly a third of it. They were numbered by ridge, not by date. Ridge 1, Ridge 2, Ridge 3, Ridge 4, Ridge 5. There were no further entries after Ridge 5. The woman nobody believed. 3 days after the cabinet was opened, before any of its contents had been made public, Mara Voss got a call that would turn out to matter more than almost anything found in that drawer. The caller was a woman named Diane Castellan, 61 years old, living 2 counties over, who had seen a brief local news mention that old evidence had been recovered near the widow's Ridge Fire Lookout site. She told Voss, in a voice that hadn't fully steadied even after 33 years, that she needed to tell someone what had happened to her on that trail. In September of 1991, because nobody had believed her the first time, and she spent 3 decades wondering if her silence afterward had cost other people their lives. In 1991, Diane had been 28, hiking the lower section of the Ridge Trail, alone on what was meant to be a short afternoon outing. She lost the marked path in a stretch where erosion had washed out the trail signs, and within an hour she was disoriented, the light starting to fail. When a man appeared from a side trail she hadn't noticed, calm and friendly, introducing himself as a volunteer with the local search and rescue team who happened to be doing a routine trail check. He offered to guide her back down. She agreed, relieved. But the route he led her on, she told Voss, didn't feel like it was heading downhill. It felt like it was climbing, cutting away from the main trail toward a narrower side path she didn't remember passing on her way up. When she said as much, he told her it was a shortcut he used himself, one that would save them both nearly an hour, and his tone never changed, never grew impatient or strange in any way she could point to afterward, except for one detail that she said she had never been able to shake. He kept glancing at his watch, not nervously, methodically, like he was timing something. Diane said the side trail eventually opened onto a narrow ledge with a drop on one side, and something about the specific way he positioned himself, slightly behind her and to her left, made an instinct she couldn't fully explain take over. She told him she twisted her ankle, sat down hard on a rock, and insisted she needed to rest. He pressed gently for them to keep moving before dark. She refused, loudly enough, she said, that her voice carried, and within a few minutes two other hikers coming up the main trail heard her and called out. The man with her straightened up, told the approaching hikers cheerfully that he just found a lost hiker and was glad they'd happened by, and helped escort all 3 of them back down to the trailhead without incident. When Diane later described the encounter to a deputy at the time, she said, the watch checking and the strange detour off the marked trail, the deputy had thanked her for the report and noted that the volunteer she was describing, by name and description, was almost certainly Walter Pruitt, the most experienced and trusted member of the very search and rescue unit that had probably saved her life. The deputy suggested, not unkindly, that disorientation and fear after getting lost and ordinary kindness feel sinister in hindsight. Diane signed nothing. No formal complaint was ever filed. 9 days later, Renata Kessler vanished on the upper ridge, and Diane Castellan, 28 years old and certain that something had been deeply wrong with the man who'd found her, told herself she must have imagined it, because the alternative was unthinkable, and stayed quiet for 33 years, the partner. The second thread that broke the case open came from a man named Earl Dunmore, 79, who had served alongside Walter Pruitt on the volunteer search and rescue unit from its founding in 1981 until his own retirement from the team in 2009. Earl had read the same local news item Diane had, and unlike her, he didn't call the sheriff's office right away. He drove to it instead, parked outside, and sat in his truck for 40 minutes before finally walking in and asking to speak with whoever was handling the Widow's Ridge cabinet. What Earl told Voss, haltingly, in a voice that kept dropping to almost a whisper, was that he had never trusted his own memory of certain things over the years and had spent a long time convincing himself that what he have remembered didn't mean what it seemed to mean. He remembered that on at least 2 of the 5 search operations, Walter had been strangely, specifically confident about which areas not to search, areas he described as too dangerous or too unlikely to check, areas that happened, all now realized looking back at old topographic maps with fresh eyes to form a rough cluster around a single ravine system on the western face of the ridge, well off any marked trail. He remembered that Walter had personally walked those exact unsearched zones alone, more than once on what he called scouting trips, after official search operations had been called off for the day. And he remembered, with the discomfort he had buried for 15 years, that in 2007, the week after Danny Castro disappeared, he had seen Walter's truck parked at a remote pullout near that same western ravine system at 4 in the morning. Hours before any search was scheduled to resume, and had decided, at the time, that it wasn't his business to ask why. I told myself he just couldn't sleep, or said. I told myself a lot of things. He paused, and let the silence sit. He saved real people, too, you understand. I watch him do it with my own eyes. I don't know how a man does both those things. I still don't. The logbook. Forensic document analysis on the recovered logbook, paired with a fresh search of the unsearched ravine cluster Old Dunmore had identified, gave us something no detective wants and every detective needs. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the ravine system, conducted over 6 difficult days by a state forensic anthropology team, located 5 separate burial sites, widely spaced. The lead anthropologist noted, with what looked like deliberate care to exploit the area's unstable scree and seasonal rock slides, ground that would naturally shift and resettle in ways that made any remains progressively harder to distinguish from the mountain's normal geology over time. Dental and skeletal analysis, cross-referenced against decades-old missing persons records, ultimately confirmed all 5. Iverson, Renata Kessler, Tomas Reyes, Danny Castro, Whitney Doyle. The logbook itself, once fully transcribed, turned out to be less a confession than a private mythology Walter Pruitt had built for himself over 4 decades, written in a tone that alternated between clinical trail log precision and something closer to scripture. He referred to himself throughout as the one who watches the gate and described each numbered ridge entry as a person who had needed, in his words too, be carried the rest of the way by someone who understood the mountain better than they ever could. There was no remorse in any line of it, and there was also, unsettlingly, no claim of pleasure. He wrote about the act the way a man might write about an unpleasant duty he had appointed himself to perform, a duty he believed, with total and unshakable conviction, that the mountain itself required of him, and that made him, in his own eyes, not its predator but its keeper. Whitney Doyle's recovered camera, once its memory card was processed by a digital forensics lab, produced one final piece of evidence that turned out to be the most damning of all. Among dozens of sunrise photographs from her final morning on the trail, the last several frames, timestamped less than an hour before her established time of disappearance, showed a figure in the background of a wide landscape shot, distant but identifiable by his distinctive red search and rescue jacket and the particular tilt of his cap. Walter Pruitt, on a part of the trail he would later tell investigating officers, in a brief and ultimately recorded interview, that he had no specific memory of visiting that week at all. The pattern revealed. Once the logbook's private numbering system was understood, Voss's team went back through 4 decades of search and rescue operation logs with new eyes, and the pattern Earl Dunmore had haltingly described became unmistakable on paper. In every one of the 5 cases, Walter Pruitt had personally drafted the search grid assignments, personally walked the sections of trail closest to where each victim was last reasonably believed to be, and personally, repeatedly, steered volunteer teams away from the Western Ravine cluster, citing terrain risk, unstable rock, or simply his own seasoned judgment. Missing person was unlikely to have gone that way. For 41 years, nobody had questioned that judgment, because questioning Walter Pruitt's judgment about mountain would have meant questioning the one thing the whole town agreed was solid ground. There was no single witness, no single piece of evidence that would have been enough on its own. It was the accumulation, the logbook and the ravine remains and Diane Castellan's 33-year-old account and all Dunmore's uneasy memory and a single grainy photograph from a dead woman's camera that finally added up to something the county prosecutor could actually act on. The arrest. Walter Pruitt was arrested at his home on Larkspur Street, 2 doors down, as it happened from Helen Castro's house with its porch light still burning on a gray morning in October of 2024. He did not resist, and according to the arresting deputies, he did not appear surprised. He asked only one question before he was placed in the patrol car. He asked whether they had found all 5 in the interview room with his attorney present and most of his answers limited to no comment. Walter Pruitt said exactly one thing that investigators considered worth recording in full, offered without apparent prompting near the end of a long silence. The mountain doesn't let just anyone carry people home, he said. Somebody has to know which ones are meant to stay. I never once made that choice for someone who wasn't already lost. Voss, reviewing the recording later, found herself thinking less about what the statement revealed, about motive, which remained as opaque to her as it had to Earl Dunmore for 15 years, and more about how completely the town's trust in this one man had functioned for 4 decades as a second kind of terrain, every bit as treacherous and every bit as invisible as the ridge itself, and how easily a community could spend a lifetime mapping every inch of a mountain's danger while leaving the most dangerous thing in it entirely unmarked. The trial. Walter Pruitt's trial in the spring of 2025 lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution built its case primarily on the forensic evidence from the ravine sites and the logbook, supported by Diane Castellan's testimony, finally given the formal weight it had been denied in 1991, and by Earl Dunmore, who took the stand and described in a voice that broke twice the truck he'd seen parked at 4 in the morning near the Western Ravine in June of 2007, and the years he had spent afterward not asking the question that would have been the only decent thing to ask. The defense argued diminished culpability based on age and a psychological evaluation describing a profoundly compartmentalized worldview, but offered no real dispute of the physical evidence. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Walter Pruitt, 84 years old by the time of sentencing, was given 5 consecutive life sentences, a sentence that everyone in the courtroom understood was, in the most literal sense, a formality. Helen Castro spoke at the sentencing hearing. She did not address Walter Pruitt directly. She spoke instead about the porch light she had left on every single night for 17 years and how she intended to keep leaving it on, not because she still expected her son to walk up that path, but because some lights, she said, aren't really for the person you're waiting for anymore. They're for everyone else still out there in the dark who needs to see that somebody never stopped looking. The case widens. The investigation did not end with the trial. In the months afterward, working from a hunch sparked by the logbook's strange numbering, which began at Ridge 1 with Carl Iverson in 1983 but read in Voss's careful rereading with the particular fluency of a man who had already done this before he started counting, investigators reached out to neighboring Route County about an unsolved 1979 disappearance that had never been formally connected to the Hollow Pine pattern. A young hitchhiker named Gregory Aldis had vanished near a Forest Service road roughly -1 miles from the Widow's Ridge trailhead in the autumn of 1979, 4 years before Carl Iverson, in circumstances that had been treated at the time as an isolated and unremarkable case of a drifter simply moving on. A renewed search of public records turned up something investigators had missed entirely the first time through. Walter Pruitt, before founding the official search and rescue unit in 1981, had spent the late 1970s as an informal volunteer with the county's loosely organized search effort, well known and well liked even then for his uncanny sense of the terrain. Ground-penetrating radar surveys extended into the Route County Forest Service land that Winter located. A sixth burial site, isolated from the others, weathered nearly 2 decades longer than any of the original 5. Dental records, painstakingly tracked down through an old county dental clinic whose files had survived only because a retiring dentist had donated his archive to a local historical society instead of discarding it, confirmed what the logbook's quiet, confident numbering had already suggested. Gregory Aldis had been the first. Walter Pruitt had simply not started counting yet. The memorial. In the summer of 2025, the town of Hollow Pine placed a small stone marker at the Widow's Ridge trailhead, replacing the plaque that had once thanked Walter Pruitt for his decades of service, which the town council voted unanimously and without public debate to remove. The new marker lists 6 names in plain lettering, beginning with Gregory Aldis and ending with Whitney Doyle, and beneath them a single line that Helen Castro herself chose the wording for after the council asked the families what they wanted it to say. The mountain never took them. Someone did. They are found now, and they are home. Diane Castellan drove up from her house to Counties over for the unveiling, stood at the trailhead for a long time without speaking, and finally placed her hand flat against the cold stone the way she might have once placed it against a door she had spent 33 years afraid to knock on. Al Dunmore did not attend. He sent a short letter instead, which Helen Castro read aloud at the family's request, in which he wrote that he did not believe he deserved to stand among them, but that he had finally, after everything, found the courage to ask the question he should have asked in 2007, and that he hoped, in whatever small way an old man's late honesty could matter, it counted for something now. Long before any of that closure was possible, though, the case had to survive something nearly as difficult as proving it. It had to survive the town's refusal to believe it. The backlash? Hollow Pine did not receive the news of Walter Pruitt's arrest the way Mara Voss expected. She had braced for grief, for shock, even for anger at the man himself. What she had not fully prepared for was the anger directed at her. Within a week of the arrest, a petition began circulating at the diner on Main Street, signed eventually by close to 300 people, nearly a fifth of the town's year-round population, calling on the county to review what the petition's organizers described as a rushed and politically motivated prosecution of an elderly community pillar based on, in the petition's own words, decades-old hearsay and a journal that could have meant anything. The outfitting shop Walter had run for 30 years and handed down to his nephew, Cole Pruitt, became an unofficial gathering point for people who simply could not square the man they knew with the evidence being described on the local news. Cole gave an interview to a Denver television station in which he stood behind the same counter his uncle had stood behind for 3 decades and said, his voice shaking, that he had hiked that ridge himself 100 times with Walter. as a boy that the man had taught him to read weather off cloud shapes and to splint a sprained ankle with a hiking pole, and that whatever the county thought it had found buried in a ravine, it had not found the man who raised him. Voss understood the impulse even as it frustrated her, because she had felt a version of it herself in the early days of the investigation, a reluctance bordering on superstition to believe that the explanation for 41 years of loss could be this ordinary, this human, this close. It is easier, she told a reporter once, off the record, in a moment of exhaustion she later regretted, for a town to believe in a cursed mountain than in a neighbor. A mountain doesn't ask anything of you afterward. A neighbor does. The skeptics found ammunition in the case's genuine uncertainties, and there were real ones. The logbook, for all its damning numbering system, never once used the word kill, or murder, or any direct admission of violence. Defense investigators argued, an elderly man's private, that strange journal about a mountain he'd spent his whole life devoted to was not, by itself, proof of anything beyond an eccentric and morbid turn of mind. Diane Castellan's account from 1991 had no corroborating physical evidence at all beyond her own memory, dismissed once already, and now, her critics in town pointed out, conveniently, revived only after a cabinet full of evidence made it safe to be believed. All Dunmore's testimony about a truck parked at 4 in the morning was, on its face, exactly the kind of detail a person could convince themselves of after the fact, shaped by hindsight into something more sinister than it had ever actually been at the time. Voss spent long nights during that period worried less about whether the evidence would hold up in court, which she increasingly believed it would, and more about whether it would hold up in the place she actually had to keep living and working. She drove past the outfitting shop on her way home some evenings and saw the lights still on, Cole Pruitt behind the counter long after closing, and she understood that whatever the jury eventually decided, this town was going to spend years deciding it all over again on its own, in diners and church basements and porches, long after the legal questions were closed. The second witness. It was during this difficult stretch, roughly 4 months before trial, that a development arrived which Voss would later describe as the case's true turning point, more than the ravine sites, more than the logbook itself. A woman named Patricia Allred, 68, who had moved away from Hollow Pine Inn, 1985, and had not set foot in the town since, called the sheriff's office after her adult daughter sent her a news article about the arrest. Patricia had been, in 1984, a 19-year-old volunteer on the Hollow Pine Search and Rescue Team during its earliest years, one of only 2 women on the unit at the time, and she had quit after 18 months under circumstances she had never fully explained to anyone, including her own family, for 40 years. She told Voss, in an interview conducted over 2 long sessions, that she had once, during a routine winter training exercise on the lower section of the ridge, gotten separated from the rest of the group in a sudden squall and found herself alone with Walter Pruitt for nearly 2 hours while the rest of the team searched for both of them. She described an experience disturbingly similar to Diane Castellan 7 years later, an insistence on an unfamiliar route, a strange and persistent watch-checking, a slow positioning of his body relative to hers on a narrow stretch of trail that she said had made every instinct in her body scream a warning she could not justify with words. Unlike Diane, Patricia had not needed to be rescued by passing strangers. The squall had lifted early, visibility had returned, and the rest of the search party had reached them within minutes of her fear cresting, an outcome she had spent decades quietly believing was nothing more than weather and coincidence rather than a second chance she had been given without ever fully understanding how close she had come to not getting one. She quit the team within the month, telling everyone, including her own parents, that she simply preferred a quieter hobby. She left Hollow Pine the following year and built a life 2 states away that never once involved a mountain trail again. When Voss asked her why she had never said anything, not in 1984, not in any of the years since, Patricia was quiet for a long time before answering. Because I had no proof, she said. Because everyone loved him. And because some part of me, even after I left, still wondered if I'd been the strange one that day, not him. It took another woman's name in the news 40 years later to tell me I hadn't imagined it after all. Patricia Allred's testimony at trial, paired with Diane Castellan's, established what the prosecution
Beyond the physical
needed. Evidence alone, a pattern of behavior stretching back to the unit's earliest years, predating even Gregory Aldis's confirmed murder, that showed the same specific conduct repeating itself across 4 decades with 2 different women who had never met each other, never compared notes, and had no possible reason to coordinate a story. It was, the lead prosecutor said in closing arguments, the difference between a single dark coincidence and a documented pattern of a predator testing the same method again and again on the people he was supposed to be protecting. The families. Much of the trial's quieter weight fell on people who never took the stand at all, the families who had spent decades being told gently and repeatedly to accept an explanation that had never quite fit. Carl Iverson's mother had died in 2011, still keeping a framed photograph of her son on her own mantle in Denver, never knowing what had happened to him. And it was Carl's younger sister, Joanne, who flew in from Arizona to sit through every day of the trial in the same seat in the gallery, taking notes in a small spiral notebook she later told a reporter she intended to mail to her mother's grave, page by page, as though there were still some way for the news to reach her. Joanne had been 18 when Carl disappeared, and she told Voss privately during a recess that she had spent 41 years believing, somewhere underneath all her grief, that her brother had made some careless mistake on that trail, slipped, fallen, been swept away by an updraft or a sudden storm, and that the hardest part of the whole investigation for her wasn't learning he'd been murdered. It was finally being allowed to stop believing it had somehow been his own fault. Renata Kessler's research partner from that 1991 field season, a retired geologist named Howard, who had spent 33 years quietly carrying the guilt of having turned back early with a twisted ankle and leaving her to hike on alone, drove up from Albuquerque for the verdict. He told the court in a brief victim impact statement that he had changed careers twice in the decade since. Partly, he admitted, because he found he could no longer look at exposed rock formations the way he once had, without thinking of the last conversation he'd ever had with a brilliant, confident young scientist who had told him cheerfully not to worry, she'd see him back at the truck in an hour. He said the verdict didn't undo 33 years of wondering whether a different decision on his part might have changed anything. It just finally told him for certain that it wouldn't have. She hadn't been careless. She had simply met someone the mountain had never warned her about. Tomas Reyes' ex-wife, who had remarried and moved to Texas long before any of the evidence came to light, sent a written statement read aloud by the prosecutor. Rather than appear in person, explaining that she had spent 25 years telling their to children who barely remembered their father that he had simply gotten lost doing something he loved. She wrote that she now had to find a way to tell them something far harder, and that she was grateful in a complicated way she struggled to fully explain even to herself that they would at least grow up knowing the truth rather than inheriting the same vague, unfinished grief she had carried for a quarter of a century. Whitney Doyle's parents, both in their 70s by the time of the trial, sat together every single day in the gallery without once speaking to reporters, and left the courthouse after the verdict was read holding hands, saying nothing, walking slowly to a car that still Voss noticed when she happened to glance at it in the parking lot bore a faded missing person flyer with their daughter's photograph taped to the inside of the rear window, 9 years old and never removed. The town reconsiders. The trial's verdict did not end the backlash overnight, but it did something the evidence alone, before 12 jurors heard it spoken aloud in a courtroom, had not managed to do. It cracked it. Cole Pruitt closed the outfitting shop for 2 weeks after the sentencing and did not give another interview. When he reopened, he had taken down the old framed newspaper clippings celebrating his uncle's rescues that had hung behind the counter for as long as most customers could remember, and replaced them, without comment, with a simple framed photograph of the -1 brass memorial plates the Forest Service would install at the ravine the following summer. Voss received, in the months after the trial, a handful of letters from townspeople who had signed the original petition, each one different in its particulars but similar in its shape, a slow, painful walking back of certainty, an admission that the writer had needed Walter Pruitt to be exactly the man they'd always believed him to be, because the alternative meant admitting that 41 years of trust in hollow. Pine's most reliable institution, the Search and Rescue Unit itself, had been built on a foundation that had never once been checked. The wider net. Even after the Routt County discovery confirmed Gregory Aldous as the first victim, Voss found she couldn't fully let the case rest, in part because of a detail in the logbook that had nagged at her since the earliest weeks of the investigation. The numbering system began cleanly at 1, with no indication anywhere in the entries that Walter Pruitt considered Aldous his true beginning rather than simply the first one he'd bothered to record. Voss had learned enough about the man's private mythology by then to take that ambiguity seriously. A keeper, in his own telling, didn't become a keeper overnight. She spent the better part of the following winter working with a state cold case unit to review every unsolved disappearance within a 50-mile radius of Hollow Pine. Going back to the early 1970s, looking specifically for cases involving solo hikers, terrain, isolated, and search efforts in which Walter Pruitt, in whatever informal capacity the era allowed, had played any role at all. It was slow and glamorous work, mostly long afternoons in records rooms in 3 different counties, cross-referencing decades-old volunteer rosters against missing persons files that had never been existed digitized, only as typed carbon copies in evidence boxes nobody had opened in 50 years. The work produced one further match, tentative but troubling. In 1976, 3 years before Gregory Aldous, a young seasonal ranch hand named Vernon had vanished from a logging access road roughly 20 miles south of Hollow Pine, in a case that had been handled at the time by a different county entirely and never cross-referenced against anything happening near the Widow's Ridge. The connection, when Voss finally found it, was thin, a single line in a yellowed volunteer sign-in sheet from an informal search party assembled to look for Otto, listing a Walter Pruitt, age 26, among roughly a dozen local men who turned out to help. No remains were ever located. No forensic evidence survived intact enough, after nearly 50 years, to draw a firm conclusion either way. Voss ultimately closed that specific thread without a formal connection, noting it only as an unresolved possibility in her case files, the kind of loose end data. Investigator learns, eventually, she has to be willing to leave exactly where it is. Helen Castro's question. Of everyone touched by the case, Helen Castro was the one who pressed Voss hardest in the months after sentencing to understand not just what had happened to her son, but why, and Voss found herself returning again and again to a single late evening conversation on Helen's porch that she would carry with her for years. Afterward, Helen had asked simply whether Voss thought Walter Pruitt had actually believed the things he said in that interview room about the mountain choosing who was meant to stay, or whether it had all been an elaborate story he told himself to make an ordinary cruelty feel like something larger and stranger than it was. Voss didn't have a clean answer. She told Helen what the court-appointed psychologist had concluded, that Pruitt showed signs of a profoundly rigid, compartmentalized worldview built up gradually over decades, in which his identity as a rescuer and his identity as whatever it was he became on those solitary scouting trips had existed side by side without ever once, in his own mind, coming into direct conflict. It was not, the psychologist had been careful to note, a clinical excuse. It was simply, as far as anyone could determine, the architecture of how the man had managed to live with himself for 41 years while also being, by every account of the people he genuinely saved, the person they trusted most on that mountain. Helen sat with that for a long while before answering. I think, she said finally, that doesn't matter as much as people want it to. Whatever he believed, he still chose every single time. The mountain didn't make him climb that ravine alone before dawn. He drove there himself. Voss thought about that conversation often in the years afterward, on the drives up to the trailhead she still made occasionally, less out of investigative necessity than something closer to habit, a way of checking that the place was still just a place, weather and rock and elevation, nothing more than that, the way it always should have been. The deeper file. There was one more thread Voss never fully closed, and it was the one that stayed with her longest after the case officially ended. Among the materials recovered from the fire-scorched cabinet, beneath the logbook and the personal effects, investigators found a second, smaller notebook, water-damaged and partially illegible, older than the rest of the collection by some margin. Its paper different stock, its binding a style no longer manufactured. Forensic document analysis dated the notebook's manufacture to sometime in the 1960s, years before Walter Pruitt would have been old enough to found anything, and the handful of legible entries inside it were not written in his hand at all. The entries that survived were sparse and cryptic, written in a looping, old-fashioned cursive, describing what appeared to be informal search efforts along a stretch of mountain terrain. The writer referred to only as the high ground, with occasional mentions of someone called simply the boy, in a tone that struck the document examiner as oddly proprietary. Almost one surviving fragment, badly faded but partially reconstructed using infrared imaging, read, "To read the ridge today, he has the patience for it more than I ever did at his age." Another, dated by context to sometime in the early 1970s, read only, "He asked good questions about which places we never search. I told him some ground keeps its own counsel and a man learns to trust that instinct, or he doesn't belong out here at all." Voss spent months trying to identify the notebook's author, working from handwriting samples against old county personnel records, church rolls, and hunting license applications going back to the 1950s. Without ever reaching a conclusion, she felt confident enough to put in a formal report. The best she could determine was that an older man, likely a long-time hunting guide or informal search volunteer active in the area before any organized rescue unit existed, had apparently spent time mentoring a much younger Walter Pruitt on the terrain. Around Hollow Pine sometime in his teenage years before Gregory Alda's, years before any of it that investigators could prove had begun. Whether that mentorship had included anything beyond trail knowledge, whether the older man's own quiet phrase about ground that keeps its own counsel meant what it seemed chillingly to suggest, or whether it was nothing more than an old hunter's poetic turn. A phrase misread by a detective who had spent too many months immersed in one man's darkness, Voss was never able to determine, and she eventually closed that thread the way she'd closed the Vernon Otto thread before it, marked unresolved, filed away, left exactly where the evidence ran out. She thought about it anyway, on quiet nights, more than she ever told anyone. She thought about how a person becomes the thing they become, whether it is planted whole and waiting from the start or built slowly, season after season, by someone patient enough to mistake a child's strange stillness for a gift worth cultivating, rather than a warning worth heeding. She never found the old notebook's author's name. She never stopped, entirely wondering whether somewhere beneath the rock of an even older, even quieter ridge, there might be one more name waiting for somebody patient enough 50 years from now to finally go looking for it. The last visit. In the spring of 2026, nearly a year and a half after the trial concluded, Voss made one final visit to Hollow Pine before transferring to a position in a different county, a move she'd been considering for a while and finally made once the last of the case's loose threads had either resolved or settled into the kind of permanent uncertainty a detective learns to carry without it crushing her. She drove up to the trailhead on a clear morning, parked near the bench that no longer bore Walter Pruitt's name, and walked the lower section of the western route, the one that hadn't existed before the ravine was searched, past the 6 brass plates set quietly into the rock. She found Helen Castro there already, sitting on a flat stone a little apart from the trail, the way she sometimes did on clear mornings now, instead of only walking up to the bench at dusk. The two women didn't say much. They sat together for a while, watching the early light move across the ridge, the way it had for longer than either of them, or Walter Pruitt, or even the old hunter in the faded notebook had ever been alive to see. It, and Helen finally said the thing Voss had come, without quite admitting it to herself, half hoping to hear. "It's just a mountain now," Helen said. "That's all I wanted, really, for it to just be a mountain again." Voss didn't tell her about the second notebook, the unidentified handwriting, the thread she'd never been able to close. Some truths she had learned over the long course of this case were worth carrying alone rather than handing to someone who had already carried enough. She said only that she thought Helen was right, that the mountain had never been anything but rock and weather and elevation, exactly what it had always claimed to be, and that the only thing that had ever truly needed finding on it had never been a person lost to the wilderness at all, but a man who had spent for decades letting an entire town mistake him for the wilderness's gentlest interpreter, when all along he had simply been its most patient predator, walking the same ground twice, once to search and once, alone before dawn, to make sure no one else ever would. Cole Pruitt sold the outfitting shop in late 2025, unable, he told the handful of people he stayed in touch with to keep standing behind a counter his uncle had stood behind for 30 years, knowing now what those decades had actually held. The new owners kept the name on the sign out of simple practicality, the cost of new signage being more than the small business could easily absorb, but they took down the old trail maps that had hung in the back room. Since the 70s, the ones with Walter Pruitt's careful, looping handwriting marking suggested routes and seasonal hazards, and Voss heard, secondhand, that the new owners had quietly burned them rather than throw them away, a small private ceremony nobody asked them to perform and nobody questioned once word got around. Diane Castellan, for her part, never went back to hiking, not on Widow's Ridge, and not anywhere else, though she told Voss once that she didn't hold the mountain itself responsible for what had happened to her or to the 6 people who never came home from it. It wasn't the trail's fault, she said. It just happened to be where he worked. She kept on her kitchen windowsill in the house to counties over a small framed photograph of the new memorial stone sent to her by Helen Castro the week it was unveiled, and she said that looking at it some mornings felt less like staring at a place that had nearly taken her life and more like looking at proof that the truth, however long it takes, has a way of climbing back out of the ground eventually, the same patient way water finds its way down a mountain no matter how much rock stands in its path. Al Dunmore died in the winter of 2026, quietly, of natural causes, and Castro was one of only a handful of people who attended the small graveside service, standing apart from his family in a way that felt, to the few who noticed, less like distance and more like a private kind of grace neither of them had ever spoken about out loud. She left, on his grave, a single sprig of the same hardy mountain grass that grew along the lower switchbacks of Widow's Ridge, and told no one why. Though Voss, hearing about it secondhand months later, thought she understood well enough. Some forgiveness doesn't need an audience. It just needs somewhere quiet enough to be left. The Widow's Ridge Trail is still open to hikers. The Forest Service repainted the trail markers in the fall of 2025, widened the eroded section where the path had once washed out and left room for confusion, and added, for the first time in the trail's history, a second marked route up the western face, cutting directly through what used to be unmapped ravine terrain. Now searched, surveyed, and, at last, fully hikers who take that western route today pass within a few hundred yards of -1 small brass plates set quietly into the rock at the base of the ravine, easy to miss unless you're looking for them, each one engraved with nothing but a name and a single word: found. Locals say the mountain feels different now, though most of them struggle to explain exactly how, given that nothing about the rock or the weather or the elevation has changed at all. Helen Castro says she thinks she finally understands it herself on the evening she still walks up as far as the trailhead bench, the one that no longer bears Walter Pruitt's name, and sits for a while watching the light change over the ridge before walking back down to a house with its porch light burning. The mountain was never the dangerous thing, she says. It was only ever exactly as dangerous as the people we trusted to walk it with us, and for 41 years, Hollow Pine trusted the wrong man to tell us where it was safe to look.